Will you pray with me? Through my words, O God, and in our hearts, feed us and show us whom to feed. Amen. Please be seated. Can you imagine if the way that Matthew counted was the way that we counted here? There are 20 people in church this morning, besides women and children. It's just so glaring. I mean, first of all, to say he fed 5,000 men, it's wonderful. But isn't it more impressive, since you're clearly counting at least half, but probably less than half, of the whole population? Wouldn't it be more impressive to say Jesus fed 10 or 12,000 people instead of 5,000 men besides, these other people who I guess were hanging around? It's just so strange. And the other accounts of this story don't do that. And that's the interesting thing about this story, the feeding of the 5,000 plus, is that it is the only story, the only miracle story of Jesus that is told in all four Gospels. That, they disagree on just about everything else, but they all agree that at some point, Jesus fed a whole bunch of people with a little bit of food. But I think this question of counting and who counts really gets at the heart of what is going on here. Because it's natural, it's human nature, right? When we talk about people, we tend to mean, people like us, people who look and talk and act and think like we do. So for the disciples, for Matthew perhaps, the primary people he was talking about was men. And so there were 5,000 of them there. And then, they brought their wives and kids. Isn't that nice? It was a different way of understanding the world. But it's one that's really familiar because we do the same thing. When we think about Americans, or when we think about people who live in Kennebunk, the odds are we think about people who look and talk and act like us, but not necessarily an accurate understanding of everyone who would call themselves an American, or everyone who would live in Kennebunk or Wells or Arundel or Sanford. See, even there, I just did it. I live in Kennebunk, and I'm thinking I'm talking to St. David, so I'm talking about people who live in Kennebunk. But that's maybe a third of us here, I think. We do this all the time. It's human nature. We take a group and we make it look like us and count everyone else as superfluous. And I think that's what the disciples were kind of doing when they come up to Jesus and say, all right, Jesus, it's late, we're in the middle of nowhere, why don't you go send these folks out so they can go get some dinner? Because it's our time now, right? It's time for the real disciples, the inner circle, the people who look and talk and act like us, the people we know. You can send everybody else away. But Jesus responds by telling them they don't need to go away. They don't need to go away. There is no reason, Jesus says, why we should separate ourselves from these other people. And it's important to remember that Jesus is doing this after the end of a very long and confusing day. He went out to this place in the middle of nowhere, not because it was the only place big enough for all of these people, but simply because he wanted to be alone. He wanted to be by himself. We didn't hear it this morning, but just before this, Jesus had gotten the news of the death of his friend, his relative, his companion in ministry, John the Baptist, a grisly death at the hands of King Herod. And so we have this moment where Jesus just wants to be alone. He wants to grieve. He wants to be by himself, to just be Jesus, just be friend of John the Baptist, and not be anybody else, not have to care for others, not have to take care of other people, but just to be himself. And so he goes away to this deserted place, but of course the crowds follow him. They see him, they know what he has to offer them, and they follow him out there. And he has compassion on them because he's Jesus. He sees them and feels bad for them, sees what they need, and so he spends the day, instead of quietly contemplating and mourning his friend, his relative, instead he spends the day teaching and healing and offering to them what he has to give them. And so it's at the end of this long day, kind of like the end of a day when you were called into work when you weren't expecting it. And at the end of this day, his disciples say, all right, Jesus, let's send these folks away. Let's send these folks away, let them take care of themselves, and we can be together. And that is another thing that we so often tend to do. When there is a need, a real or a perceived need out in the world, so often our first instinct is to say, well, you should really fix that. You should really take care of that. You should, if you're hungry, you should really go out and get some food. And if you don't have enough money to buy food, well, then you probably should have worked harder to begin with. You should really tug on those bootstraps so that you can get enough to eat. And we do this a lot, right? We lay the responsibility for meeting life's basic needs at the feet of every individual. And in one respect, that makes a lot of sense, right? That we're all responsible for ourselves. We've got to take care of ourselves. Nobody should expect simply to be carried along by the community without participating, without doing anything. And we look at our own lives. We say, look, I've earned money, I've worked for it, I've made sure that I have enough to take care of myself and my family. I've made sure that I'm going to have enough to live on for a while. I've done what I need to do, and so this good life that I have is my reward. Hey, Mila, can you keep it down? People are having a hard time hearing. Thank you, sweet pea. Every Sunday's Bring Your Child to Work Day. So we have this idea out there that we are all responsible for ourselves, right? That we're the only ones who can do what we need to do. And more importantly, I think, we have this idea that others are responsible for themselves. That if I see someone else's need, that is first and foremost their responsibility. They need to feed themselves. They need to take care of themselves. They need to do what they need to do. And if they don't have the resources, they should have thought of that earlier. And it's not my problem. And to a certain extent, that's what the disciples are saying. They're saying, look, Jesus, we didn't invite these people out here. It's the middle of nowhere. If they wanted dinner, they really should have thought of that before they got out here. So send them away. You know, that's the most kind thing we can do to them right now is say, all right, go on, go get some food. But Jesus looks at them and says they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Jesus points to us as being responsible for feeding those around us. We are responsible for meeting the need that we see in the world. Jesus doesn't look at us and say, well, you're all set. Those folks over there, don't worry, I've got them. Jesus looks at us and says, all right, you see need, I see it too. What are you going to do about it? And it's frightening because there is a lot of need. And we all see a lot of it. Not only face to face, but we hear about it, we read about it, we see it on the news. We see the need that is around us, and it can feel overwhelming, but it is important that we remember these words of Jesus. When we see the hungry, when we see the needy, when we see those who are suffering, Jesus is looking at us and saying, you give them something to eat. You help them. It's your responsibility. We belong to each other. We are responsible for each other. And so the disciples give up their bread and their fish. And they were probably thinking, okay, Jesus, this is what we've got, 5 loaves and 2 fish. It was barely going to be enough dinner for, the 12 of us, besides women and children. But here you go. They've been with him enough at this point that they trust to do what he says to do. And so Jesus takes the bread, and he blesses it, and he gives it to the disciples, and they give it to the crowd. And all ate and were filled. And there were 12 baskets of leftovers. Miraculous, astounding, amazing. And there's another interpretation of this story that's kind of floated around out there. The idea that rather than miraculously multiplying the loaves and the fishes, making more out of what was already there, that perhaps in this demonstration of generosity, in taking these 5 loaves and 2 fish and showing to everyone that this group had said, here, Jesus, take this food and share it with everyone. Our needs are everyone's needs. Our goods are for the good of all. That was enough to inspire the generosity of everyone who had brought a little something extra. Everywhere around those 5,000 people. And let's be honest, who is carrying the extra food when we make our way out to the middle of nowhere? It's not the men. It's not. It's the women and the children, while the men are off saying, great, we're going to go see Jesus. And someone is saying, hang on, I'll pack up some bread. It's true. And that generosity was enough to inspire generosity from everyone else. So every household takes out from their own little store to share with those around them, and that with one act of generosity, there is an abundance that's already there if only we can give up the idea that what's ours is ours for us alone. That if only we can grasp the idea that what we have belongs to everyone, that we are responsible for the need we have in the world. And the truth is, I don't think it matters which of these is true. Whether this is an act of miraculous multiplication at the hands of Jesus, or an act of equally miraculous generosity at the hands of all of those gathered there, because what matters most is that everyone acknowledged that we do not belong to ourselves, that we belong to one another, that our need is for everyone. Our goods are for the good of all, and that we are responsible for meeting the need that we see in the world. And this is scary. This is a scary thing to think, because if I give up what I have to give it to those who have nothing, doesn't that make me and the person who has nothing the same? Because if I have what I have, because I have lived a good and virtuous life, have scrimped and saved, have made sure that I've got enough, aren't I better than the person who hasn't done that? Aren't I better than the person who has ended up with nothing? We may not think that out loud or say it out loud, but I think that's part of what's going on in our minds. Because if we give up what we have, we are no better than those who have nothing. And that's the point. That's the point. The whole reason Jesus reminds the disciples that we belong to each other, that we are responsible for meeting the need that we see in the world, is the simple idea that we are all the same. That we all are equal before God, that the things that we have, the things that we have been given, are not ours to hoard, but they've been given to us in trust to meet the needs that we see in the world around us. That we can acknowledge that the person with nothing could be us, and we could be them. There is no distinction. We belong to each other. And if we can acknowledge that, if we can grasp that, if we can understand that the need that we see is in fact our responsibility because those who are in need are a part of us. There's no distinction. There's no meaningful division between who is worthy and who is not, between who counts and who doesn't, between who belongs and who doesn't. We belong to each other. We are responsible for meeting the needs that we see in the world, and that is frightening because we are worried that there will not be enough. But Jesus doesn't ask us to be unafraid in this. He asks us to be generous. He asks us to be faithful. He asks us to be loving and compassionate, to remember that we belong to those who are in need, and they belong to us. And with that understanding and knowledge, with that compassion, we may have the strength to overcome our fears, to offer the loaves and the fish that we have, give them to Jesus so that he may give them to the world. Amen.